Anyway, so the idea is this. In the classic idea, there would be a person here. Can we see it? Oh, and this person would relate to the world, maybe a chair. And the chair would be apart from him as an object in the world. Right? And classical science then proceeds not to look at what's here in the middle, but starts to look at this chair as an object in the world. So this object consists of 2 of these planks and 4 of these legs and 2 other holders, and they have certain dimensions. And actually, these planks really consist of molecules. It's organic, so it's like this long string of carbon with hydrogen and blah, blah, blah connected to it. I don't remember from chemistry, it's a long time ago. And then actually that consists of atoms that are with electrons running around them. And well, we found that all out, and then actually that's all quantum mechanics, which you can't really draw anymore, but they have pictures that look like this, and I never understand them. And then actually it turns out that these things are all really snares, which I don't know what snares are. So now we've sort of analyzed the chair as an object in the world, and we have applied everything we know from science to reduce it to its essence, which is snares. Don't know what that is. But that's what science does, right? Now you can also say, that's what the psychologists say, that in fact all of this stuff is actually thought by scientists. So you have a big thought balloon here, and there's a person here thinking about this chair. You still see it? Yeah, you see it. And this chair, he's thinking, what is this chair? Well, this is really planks with blah, blah, and wood and things and certain dimensions. And what is this? Well, this is really just atoms and carbon and blah, blah, blah. And that's really just atoms. And that's really just quantum mechanics. And that's really just snares. So what you get at the end of this story is like either everything is in our head as the theory that we have about the world, or it is real stuff in the world. And what the scientist tries to do is to make sure that everything that we have in our head about the world matches what is actually there in the world, in reality, right? Now, what phenomenology does is saying, well, I'm going to bracket all of this away. I'm going to put big brackets around it, and I'm going to bracket all of this away as well. Can't really draw it that well. This also, bracket away, and I'm going to look at what's here. What is there in the raw first experience of me observing, and not observing, but experiencing the chair? And Gibson would immediately put up his finger and say, what's there is the affordance of a to sit on. The chair is first and foremost something for me to sit on, depending on the situation that I'm in. Yeah? Let's see if I drew what I... Well, sorry. Okay. Now, this is the first famous phenomenology. Edmund Husserl, from the German-Austrian Empire, which was then still there. Where's my notes? Oh, no, I think I forgot my notes. I will do it by heart. So, he was living in a time where psychology was just starting to become somewhat of a science. People were trying to investigate in rigorous ways how perception works and how memory works and how thinking works and what it is. But it was still very much connected to philosophy, because before psychology became something of a science, it was just philosophy, thinking about how can we think about the world. There were lots of discussions about how do our thoughts relate to the world, and how can we ever get knowledge of the world. But all of those discussions were still based on the ground assumption that there is some kind of world out there, And the question was, how can we get access to it? And then, for instance, Descartes had said that we can't really be sure of anything but our own thoughts about the world. So maybe everything we see is an illusion about the world. So the only thing I'm sure of is my own thoughts, because I know I'm thinking them. So I know that they exist, and everything else might be an illusion. And there's a lot of discussion like that. And Husserl was, of course, very much influenced by that. He was also very much influenced by Kant, but I won't have time to dig into Kant, because that will is a whole lecture series in itself. And then he sort of was the first to say, okay, I'm going to bracket away, which was what he called. So I'm going to bracket away all these scientific assumptions about external reality, and I'm going to look at the phenomenon itself, how it appears to me, how I'm going to look at my own experience of the world. I'm going to go back to the things themselves. Zu den Sachen selbst is the famous slogan of Husserl. So this bracketing was one thing that he introduced. He calls it the phenomenological reduction. And the reduction means that you sort of stripe away everything that common sense tells you, and you look at the world anew from a phenomenological perspective. And the other thing that he was famous for was for introducing or reviving the concept of intentionality. Now, intentionality is I'm using all materials here. So that's a very difficult concept normally, and I'm only explaining it here because we don't have time to go into it in detail. But I'm explaining it mostly because there is a normal way in which you can think about intentionality, and that's just that you intend to do things, right? I'm intending to give this lecture, and then now I'm doing it, just before I was intending to do it. But that's not what phenomenologists mean with intentionality, or that something was intentional instead of by accident, right? That's how we normally use it. How they use it is what usually people say is that it's about the aboutness of our thoughts. So if we think something, if we are conscious of something, as I am conscious of you being present here, I'm not just conscious as a state in my head that is not connected to anything outside myself. Every conscious state is always about something in the world. So there's this intrinsic relation between my thought here and the thing there that I'm thinking. And this is the intentionality. So my thoughts are always directed towards something. Oh, and then you can't read it. So here it was. But, for instance, somebody like Heidegger, who was a student of Husserl, in the end came to reject this whole idea of intentionality because he still thought, well, it still pretty much sounds like I'm having thoughts in my head about the world out there, right? That still seems to be this split between the mind and the world. And he wanted to get rid of that. But in any case, consciousness or thinking was no longer something that was purely in the head, as the idealists said. It was always related to the outside world. And the question was, how is it related? So that's Husserl. And he wanted to get back to the things themselves, to the raw experience of how we experience the world, before we start to talk about it, before we start to theorize about it, before we start to explain it. And that all needs to be bracketed away. How do we experience it in the moment itself? That's what he wanted to get at. Which is very difficult, because if you're a philosopher, before you know it, you start to think about the stuff, right? There's one other misunderstanding that I want to get rid of. This is also a definition of experience that you might know from your own field. So on a weblog, I read User experience is not like usability, it is about feelings. The aim here is to create happiness. You want people to feel happy before, during and after they have used your product. It's a touchy feeling kind of thing. Why, for instance, does an Audi S6 give you a much better user experience than a Ford Focus? I mean, in terms of usability, they're pretty much the same. So we've had this whole wave of user experience design, what this is part of, and that's definitely not the kind of experience that phenomenologists speak about. And phenomenology has also creeped into human-computer interaction, and before you know it, people start to mix these things, and they start to think that phenomenology is sort of a backup theory for explaining why we do user experience design. But if you want to design for happiness, that's all fine. But you can just as well talk about the phenomenology of usability. There's no problem in talking about the phenomenology of usability, because in the end, if I grasp a tool and I automatically know how to use it, then it's all about my first raw experience of what the tool is to me when I grab it. And that's a much more basic kind of talk about experience than this stuff. Right? And phenomenologists are talking about the first raw primary form of experience that we have with the world, without any talk about being happy or having a great experience or stuff like that. Of course, they also talked about that, but that's one particular form of it. So, this is not what we're talking about. This is Heidegger, the young Heidegger, talking with Edmund Husserl, his teacher. And you see now here in this picture sort of symbolically how the first ideas are now giving to the new generation, and it takes a few generations to really get rid of old habits, so to speak. So Heidegger took a lot from Husserl, but he also really attacked him and said he was basically wrong about everything in the end. So that's what happens with the professors and their students. Half an hour to go, good. We're doing fine. So let's jump right into Martin Heidegger then. That's the most difficult one. If you read that, I really cannot really understand. I'm trying to understand it and reading books about the people that wrote about Heidegger and so on, and try to make sense of it. He puts a lot of Greek into it, so if you don't know Greek, then you miss half of the page, because there's suddenly all this Greek in it. Some people might find it easy. But what he's actually doing is, he said, I'm no longer asking the question of how we can access the world out there, how we can know the world. He was asking the question of being itself, the being of being. So we have a lot of things that are, like this thing is, the beamer is, the laptop is, and the table is, and we are. But what does this being of these things, what does that actually mean? What does it mean to be? Which is a difficult question. And he was saying that, I need to look a little bit here, because otherwise I'm forgetting. I need to, because I wanted to take this, but I forgot to bring it. You can see how complex this is. Yes, so he introduced this strange concept, which is called Dasein. And Dasein, that's us, basically. So if you want to think about it most simplistically, it's people. People are Dasein. But Dasein does not mean thoughts in our heads. Right? So the usual way we think about ourselves is as we are thinking beings, right? We are a bunch of thoughts together that look into the world and think about it, right? That's not what he called Dasein. That's not what how he described our being. He said our being is basically a form of coping with the world. We are essentially copers. We are people that deal with the world. We are involved with the world. He also talked about caring. We care for the world. And we are with the world. And we are in the world. And we're not outside of the world looking at it as spectators, but we are right in the middle of it and we're dealing with it. We're dealing with circumstances as they present themselves to us. And that was his big move. So while Husserl was still pretty much like this detached philosopher sitting behind in his armchair thinking about the world, Heidegger was also sitting in an armchair. And then he said, I'm not sitting in an armchair, I'm in the world. Actually, he went into the forest and he had a special hut there and he chopped wood and he felt really one with nature and stuff like that. There's also, he reads a lot of poetry and his whole theory is about the poetry, and he was brought up strongly Catholic, so there's also religious overtones in his work, and at some points it becomes really vague and almost like poetry. You don't really make sense of it anymore. But his major work, which is called Sein und Zeit. How do you write Zeit like this? Is that correct? German people?
Also Zeit.
It's the other way around? Yeah. Just this way around. Like this. And from that book, only the first half of the first book was published, and there would be the first part of the first book, and there would be 3 parts of the first book, and then a second book, but it never got published. Only the first part of the first book got published, and that was such a breakthrough in that you could say that all of continental philosophy, everything that followed from that, like the postmodernist and the post-structuralist and Latour and everybody, they are all in a way Heideggerians, because he influenced all of them in really making this step from seeing ourselves as thinking beings that live inside our heads towards seeing ourselves as involved copers, people that deal with stuff and are right there with the world. So we don't have to have an inside thought of the world. We don't have to answer the question of how we can know the world. We already know the world because we are in the world. We are part of the world. And Dasein is the world. It's being in the world. And this movie that we're going to see Friday is also called Being in the World. And it figures the philosopher Dreyfus, who is an American philosopher, and they usually talk in more normal language than the French and the German people. So you have the idea that you sort of understand what Heidegger means when Dreyfus explains it. Then again, there is also French and German philosophers that say, well, the way that Dreyfus explains it makes no sense, it's completely nonsense, and he didn't understand anything himself. So that's the problem always with these things. Heidegger. Well, there's a problem also with Heidegger that you must know, that he was a fascist. So in the war, he was really on the wrong side of he made a big mistake in politically, so to speak. He was head of the university, and he even expelled Husserl, who was already had his he was already emeritat, so pensioned. No, he stopped working. Like he was 65, retired. That's the word. Thank you. He was already retired, but he still was lecturing as a retired professor, and he actually expelled Husserl because he was Jewish, and so that was really the final break between them. And it's very strange, interesting story, because one of his students is Hannah Arendt, a famous philosopher, and Hannah Arendt is also Jewish, and they even had a sort of a relationship in the beginning. So how all of that went, and what his very strongly right extremist wife Elfriede had to do with all of that, I don't know. But anyway, it was pretty messed up politically and personally. But his book is still sort of one of the most important philosophy works in Western philosophy of the previous century. And I must explain now something, because one thing that was most important for which sort of entered human-computer interaction through several people was this idea between Zuhandenheit and Vorhandenheit. So if I have a person here, that's what Heidegger talked about. He said, if I'm an involved coper, if I'm thrown... oh, lower again. So if I'm thrown into this world, and I'm dealing with the world in an absorbed way, let's consider, for instance, the carpenter, or the, that is working on his hammer, with his hammer, and he's working on this chair. Then how does the carpenter deal with this hammer? What is the hammer to him? And classical theory would say that the hammer is an object that you need to analyze in order to be able to know what to do with it. So this would mean that you would sort of look at the definition of the hammer. Maybe there's a sign on the wall saying, okay, this is a hammer, and it has all kinds of properties, and maybe it has like a manual. First you do this, then you do that, then you do that. And that is called the voorhanden mode of being. So if I'm analyzing the hammer as an object, which I would do in this way, then the hammer is voorhanden to me. And basically all of science talks about the world, everything that they talk about in the world, all that figures in their theories is always voorhanden. It's what Dreyfus calls translate this as present at hand. But now Heidegger said that is not the basic mode of being of the hammer for the carpenter. Because the more basic mode of being of the hammer for the carpenter is that the hammer is in his hands and he's working away and he's not focused at all at the hammer, he's focused at the work. So he's looking not at the hammer but he's looking at the work, and the hammer sort of becomes an extension of his own body. And in that sense, the hammer sort of withdraws. It disappears from view, you could say. And you only see, you're not looking at the hammer anymore, you're looking at the work through the hammer. It guides the way you perceive the world. And then the hammer is in a zuhanden mode. And that is called ready to hand. And it's totally unfair to Heidegger to only explain this, because he talked about a lot of things, and he had long chapters on Dasein and also about moods, anxiety, the fact that we are always going towards our death, being towards death, and so on. So there's big stories to be told about Heidegger, but this little piece here is immediately relevant, I think, for designers that want to design tools for people. To not make the mistake that you design a computer system that asks you to analyze the interface in a voorhanden mode of being. Because then it doesn't work for you, right? Ultimately, you want the computer to be ready to hand for you, so that you can work on your project instead of you have to work on the computer. Good, we have more to discuss. We have Mr. Merleau-Ponty. So that's much later, in the 1960s and 50s, where it's you had this French philosopher. I think he never met Heidegger in person, but he was definitely influenced by him and also by other phenomenologists. He did meet Sartre. So Sartre you might know from the books and the theater plays, and that was also a famous phenomenologist. I don't have time to say anything about him. So they talked, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty was the first one to really look much more deeper into the role of the body. So the body was sort of implicitly there in Heidegger. He says, when I'm involved coping and I'm carpenter and I'm working with my hammer, then the hammer becomes an extension of the body. I think he He might have said something like that somewhere himself. At least other people have said it, interpreted him in that way. But Merleau-Ponty really made that explicit. Now I have to look again a little bit on what I wanted to say about Merleau-Ponty. Lots of stuff again. The primacy of action before perception, body as a grounding structure, body as the object versus the lived body, and optimal grip. Yes, good. Let's try to do that. So what Merleau-Ponty was looking at perception, how we perceive the world. In a way, he was more a psychologist, or in the direction of psychology, than Heidegger, who was really a grand philosopher that talked about the being of the beings, and about Aristotle and Plato and Socrates and so on. Merleau-Ponty made use of, for instance, lots of neurological patient data about people that have strange neurological diseases, and from that he was trying to deduce how do we actually deal with the world, and how do we actually perceive the world. And he said perception is not something that comes before action. Perception is not something that analyzes an already existing world, as if there's first a world out there, and then you start to look at it, and it comes in through your eyes, and then you have to analyze the picture that is on your retina, right? That's the usual story that you've been told about how the brain works and how the eye works. And he said it's not at all like that. Perception is a loop that goes all through your body, and it is very much connected to action. And you can better speak about action and perception as being one than take them apart. And perception is very active. It's a way of how you direct yourself towards the world. So I'm involved with something, I'm looking at something, I'm going around it with my body. And there's this one thing that Merleau-Ponty talks about, which is optimal grip. And optimal grip means that in my interaction with the world, I try to get ever more precise in getting the most optimal view of the world, so to speak. So there's this kind of, I can look at this beamer from this side, and this projector, and I can look at it from this side, and I can look at it from this side. But if I'm looking at it, I will turn my body and my eyes in such a way that I sort of get the optimal perspective from which to be able to see this projector for what it is. And everything has a sort of optimal perspective in which it shows itself to me, and it has also less optimal perspectives. And if it's less optimal, then I don't have optimal grip yet, then I'm starting to move, then I start to look around and manipulate it until I see it in its best possible appearance to me. So that makes perception a very active process, and it also makes it a process that sort of is seeking a balance, right? It's sort of trying to reduce some disbalance between yourself and what you're dealing with until you find the right spot and you say, yes, this is how I want to see it. This is how it shows itself to me in its best perspective. And he says, you don't need to have knowledge in your head in order to do that. What we do is that when we look at the world for the first time, when we get born, and through our whole development, we just make ever more fine-grained distinctions in what the world asks us to do. So if you think about these in terms of these affordances, Merleau-Ponty would say that you create ever your set of affordances that you are able to cope with increases when you learn a skill. So let's try to draw this. Let's try to see where's the top. Oh, there. Okay, let's go below this. It's not completely calibrated. So, okay, I'm, again, this person. Keep drawing men. Maybe I should draw a girl. Oh, now it's a guy again. suppose I'm dealing with the world and I'm not skilled. I'm like this beginner in sailing. I'm sitting in my sailboat, trying to sail. That's where it starts. It starts with action, not with looking. I'm already starting to sail. I'm trying to do it. And then I look at all these boats. And I see they all look the same to me. There's no distinction. So they all afford the same action, which is they don't afford any action at all, right? Or maybe just be scared, like what's happening here. That's the state it asks from me. But then, when I start to learn about sailing, suddenly I start to make distinctions between different sailboats. So if I draw this very abstractly, you could say that when I learn a skill, you might say that I get a certain tool in hand that I know how to work. And suppose I have this tool, then suddenly I can now see all kinds of things in the world that fit this tool. I can see these kinds of things. And all the rest of the world is still the rest of the world. I make no further distinctions. I can only see things that I can work with this tool, and for the rest I don't know. But then suppose I learn another skill, or I increase my skills and I have another tool, and I have now this kind of tool. This is an abstract picture I'm trying here. And I can now deal with the world in another way. Then this means that I now can also suddenly, in the world, I see these kinds of things popping up. I never knew they were there. But suddenly, because I have this tool to deal with the world in that way, I can now make a distinction between these guys, these kinds of things, and these kinds of things. And merleau-ponty says, what you're actually doing when you perceive is you make these distinctions. Suddenly the world is divided in two for me. Things that I can deal with in this way, or things that I can deal with in that way. Now suppose I learn another skill. I learn maybe this kind of skill. Then suddenly I can see another kind of object appearing for me. And what merleau-ponty now is actually saying is that these objects were not there in the world to begin with. Right? That's the thing that phenomenology keeps getting back to. These objects were not already pre-given and we only needed to analyze them or get to understand them. These objects are in part created because I have these skills. Can you see this? Yeah, oh, that's fine. So because I am dealing with the world in my way and my body, with my possibilities, the world shows up for me as meaningful to me. So I see different objects in the world than you see them. Because each of us has different skills. Yeah, so I don't know if this makes any clearer. I'm still working on this picture. I'm making it ever more clear. And at a certain point, when you're dealing with some kind of task or activity, you think, this is how the world is good for me, and I'm now satisfied with how the world looks to me, and then you have this optimal grip. And what Hubert Dreyfus explains in relation to that is that you can actually sometimes get into what musical people call the groove, or sports people call the zone, which is the kind of state of flow that this person Cimentiani or something talked about. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but he wrote this book called Flow, which was when everything is just right. Right? I don't know if there's any people that really have a skill like sports or music, and they know this from first hand. Because I'm not really a strongly skilled.
I've noticed it with music, but also sometimes when programming, it can help you really have fun and sort of get into the flow.
And then suddenly
dive into it and you forget about time.
Yes, apparently it's very much related to time. Time really starts to slow down, and you just have suddenly you have all the freedom, so to speak, in the world to just do it exactly right.
Sometimes you just have all the right stuff is just coming to you,
bloop, bloop, bloop.
and it's just a matter of time slows down. It's just like all the things are coming to you in the right order.
Yes.
Exactly how to say it before you're even at that point, and it just keeps adding up. So you're just going by the draft that's already there.
Now, and what Sartre, for instance, would say, and merleau-ponty would agree with him, is that at that point, you yourself cease to be there. There's no longer a you. There's only the activity, the doing, the flow itself. You and the thing you're doing is become one, and you're like you can make sounds with that go with it, or special colors in the movie. But right, and only when something goes wrong, then suddenly like you snap out of it, and then you have something broken there that doesn't work, and then you come back into view, and then you have a problem, and the problem is there, and you are here. But when you're completely in the flow, there's no longer a you, and there's no problem. It's just flow. It's only flow. Yeah. Oh, I have 7 minutes here. Good. I can see it. Thank you. Okay. So let's see where we are. Maybe we can already wrap up. We did the most important ones. Merleau. So you can now start to think a bit about the sailboat example, drawing in Husserl and Heidegger and merleau-ponty, or skiing. Yeah, I wanted to draw a final picture, just for fun. Okay. So, as a summary, we only had very little time. So you really must read more yourself, or follow a course in phenomenology somewhere. There's like 20 lecture courses on just on Heidegger, or then you have to read this book. But just for a summary, the main thing to get from this, I guess, at this point, is that there is a difference between objectively looking at the world as a pre-given reality and then analyzing it, and the phenomenological perspective. So again, what scientists would do is that they would say, okay, actually what scientists do is that they don't look at themselves first as observers. They look first at the object, and they just say, well, there are things in the world. So this is a thing in the world, and it's just there. And that's what they start with, talking. Right? And then they say, well, if this thing is here, and if I'm looking at it, they become a little bit of philosophers. They say, well, the first thing that must happen is that I must see this thing, right, with my eye. So the first thing is that there is object in the world. And the second thing that happens is perception of the object. And then the third thing that what happens is that I'm now thinking the object, because I just saw it. So it's now in my head. Right? And then the fourth thing that might happen is that you do something. You might grasp it. So you act on it. The fourth thing, yeah. Yes? And if you need a tool, then the tool is just another object lying there, and you need to observe both these things, and put them together in some kind of theory on how the one relates to the other, and then you can act on it the right way. So this is, you could say, Cartesian thinking. And it's all over science. Then phenomenology would say, well, I'm here. I already have this tool in hand. And there is no object just there, right? There is only my involved coping with the world, which goes on and on. And in that involved coping with the world, which is really not I'm drawing it the wrong way, because there is no distinction here. I'm in the world, so this is the world, and I'm right in there, in the middle of it. I'm dealing with stuff, and then I make these, because I'm becoming more skilled at dealing with the world, I make these ever more fine-grained distinctions. So at some point, things like objects might show up for me that are meaningful to me. And they really wouldn't be like these abstract, ideal mathematical shapes that I draw here, right? That's giving the wrong impression in a way, because they would be meaningful things for me, like maybe things I could have for breakfast when you're walking in a supermarket. That would be the kinds of things that pop up for me suddenly. You're walking in the supermarket and you spot immediately things that I could have for breakfast, right? And then only later the phenomenologists say, okay, you could maybe temporarily step out of that and enter in a mode of reflection. And in that mode of reflection, you could start to think about your own actions and think about your own involved coping in the world. So this would be step 1, and then at some point you get this step 2, and then maybe here step 3. But that reflection on action is only the final step, and when you really make that into a kind of system with rules for how to reflect, and you start to talk with other people about it, and you start a community and a big building, and you start to draw in students and so on, then you get science. Right? But that's all way past this very much more basic form of being in the world. So this might be 4. Whereas here, to round off, science just says, this is really step 0, science. And all of that is within science. Yeah, classical, traditional science theory and the phenomenological perspective. Okay. So that's it. Exactly 11 o'clock, so we did phenomenology in 1 hour. Everybody that has to leave, you are really excused to go, because I promised you 1 hour and everybody's working hard on their project. But if you want to stay, I have some time for questions or talk a little bit more about it. So I'll just be staying here, and thanks for everybody for being here. And you don't have to go because the others go. But you can go. Feel free.
Thanks for the feedback.
Yeah, good.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yep. So who has a question? Or you guys just staying because you didn't stand up yet?
No, because we want to hear the questions.
Nantia, you have a question? Do you have a question? Does somebody have a
My
question?
question is more like when both people are skilled in something. So when 2 sailors are so skilled in something, how together they perceive the new boat that is coming. And
Yes.
it also changes things.
Yes,
It's
good.
not how-
Yeah,
Yes.
you touched a very important thing, which is the social dimension.
Yeah.
And I have not discussed that at all. It's a big part in, there's a big part in merleau-ponty. Merleau-ponty is really about one person perceiving the world, but he says, I'm perceiving the world as others perceive me. And then what he means with that, there's a long text. So he has a lot of thinking about when I look at you and when I perceive you, I already perceive that you perceive me. And that is also how you show up to me. So instead of a sailor looking at sailboats, when I'm a person looking at other people show up to me as people that see me. And then you get into this kind of loop, right? Because they see me, but I was acting, and acting was part of the way that I see you, because acting was part of perception. So things really become looped between people. And he has a lot of theory on that. I'm not really the expert on that part. It's also difficult for me still. But there's this whole word called cross-perception, which is this idea of I see you seeing me.
But it doesn't matter the skills of the other person or just the presence of the other person close to you?
I don't know. That's an interesting question. It would be an interesting question whether the other person is skilled in what you were doing at the moment. Because merleau-ponty doesn't talk so much about the skills in the way that Heidegger literally discussed the hammer and the carpenter in his workshop. Heidegger was also, it was much older, of course, so there were still more traditional craftsmen, and he also idolized that a bit. He was that might have been actually part of his fascist tendencies to say, like, he really liked this the blacksmith that was hammering away with his muscles and having a wife and 10 children, and it's that kind of romantic ideal. So that's a bit tricky part of him. But and then there's other phenomenologists, like for instance Alfred Schütz, and he really, his whole phenomenology is about social. So he says that other phenomenologists really did not look into the social dimension, and he's also generally considered to be a sociologist with a phenomenological perspective on sociology. So that he might be interesting. And Paul Dorish, that you might know from Where the Action Is, like half of the book of Paul Dorish is based on Schütz. But I didn't have time to put that into this lecture.
And also the other thought that I had is about the setting. So it's different when you are in a workshop and you have your tool and you hammer something and something happens and you have to change and you have to solve the problem. Or if you are here and you have the hammer.
Yeah.
So it's also where you are.
Exactly. And that's what Heidegger really stressed. It's not just me and the hammer, but also how the hammer relates to all other tools and things that together make up the workshop. And it's really being in the workshop. And that's where he actually had a little bit of a social connection, because he also talked about how you are a carpenter in the community, in your village, and then you are already approached as the carpenter when somebody steps into your office and so on. And so even when you walk on the street, you are the carpenter. And Dreyfus talks a lot also about, he relates also this whole phenomenological talk to your vocation, so to speak, so which means your destiny as a person. Like what is it that you are working up to being? So my destiny or my vocation might be to be a teacher. And now, what does it take to be a teacher? It's not some kind of goal in the future, like I want to be a professor at MIT or something like that. That is like more a wish, but that the fact that I want to be a teacher shows in my behavior continuously, and I can also at some times move away from that and actually be doing kinds of things that are not in line with what I'm supposed to be. They talk about that a lot as well. Is there other things?
Any phenomenologists have much to say about learning skills or choosing which skills to learn? Kind of having in the back of my mind this adage about if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yeah.
I don't know who said that.
Yeah.
And now our world is so complicated. There's many more potential skills we could be learning. How, without stepping outside ourselves, can we decide between
which skills to learn? Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I only know that Dreyfus wrote a whole paper about how you learn a skill and how you become an expert from the novice to beginner, proficient, expert stage. And that's interesting, but that already assumes that you know what you're going to be learning, like driving a car or playing chess or whatever. But this latter point, it might refer more back to this vocation thing, like when are you spending your time meaningfully, and when are you sort of wasting your time learning skills that are not meant for you, right? I guess it's really a developmental thing, but I don't know what phenomenologists would say about it, but that would be my first thought based on what I understand of it so far, is that you never start from scratch. So when you've been doing a lot of stuff in a certain direction, that gives you a certain kind of body with a certain set of skills, which means that you see the rest of the world in terms of what your skills make of the world. And so any new skill that you are considering is already part of it. It is a thing, it's an object in that world that you see based on your own skills already. So my son is very athletic, I'm not. He jumps on chairs, and so he sees the world as a big playground where you could climb on and jump on. So I guess if somebody comes along and teaches him a new trick of making a salto, then he would immediately be interested, while somebody else would say, "Oh no," and would immediately walk away. Yeah. But yeah, something like that. That's a good question. What about you guys?
I was thinking like how to apply this to design, because if you're saying that the phenomenologist said that everyone sees the world according to your skills, like how can you then decide what is the media or the parameter to start designing something for someone if everyone have a different perception of the world?
Yeah.
There should be one point in the middle that everybody should fit, because you cannot design for every perception of the world.
Yes, exactly. Well, maybe you need to draw in the social factor immediately and say, okay, I'm not really designing for individual people, but people are part of a community of practice, and so you can already look at patterns of what works and doesn't work in that practice. But maybe the main lesson to start with would be to not try to describe the skill and in a more abstract manner, but really to always, if you're in a project and you're designing for, I don't know, people in the hospital that have to work with these index cards that you put on the beds to know which patient goes where and whatever, and you have to design a new thing for that. Maybe it has to become a tablet interface or whatever. To not try to abstract away from the actual work and then describe the routine as a sort of an abstract procedure. Right? That would mean that you from this actual sailing practice, you make it into something like this, and then before you know it, you start to make a computer system that literally implements this. The computer system is just this, but then you miss out on all the experience of what happens if you're actually in a real sailboat. So to look into the details of a practice, that's maybe one thing that resonates with phenomenology. It's not only the phenomenologists that have said that, right? Also, a lot of these people in sociology that said they say you have to look into the practice, and the practice is more important than the theory around it, and so on. They make the same point. And you have, for instance, Lucy Suchman, who I put her on one of these slides. She's here. She's one of the big people in ethnomethodology that studies people's practices and says we don't want to have big theories on what they're supposed to do, we're just going to look what they actually do. And she actually studied, her thesis was written with Hubert Dreyfus as a professor. Well, she came from anthropology, or sociology, anthropology kind of way. And she was big into conversation analysis, that was her method. But then you see in the book that there's a lot of phenomenology in there, and that's just because one of the professors happened to be a phenomenologist. So that's a nice link there between those two fields that both have had their influence on human-computer interaction.
But I think the interesting part is here in the sailing, we're not thinking how we can design the new boat or something new in sailing. It's only understanding how we perceive sailing and how we can be better sailors, I think, no? But it's a different way of thinking. We're saying, what's the new boat that is going to help us to sail better?
Yeah, okay, well, one step towards that would be to say that even in sailing you have to improvise, and when you improvise you have to find new solutions on the spot for things, so then you become a little bit of a designer in the sense of, and if you take that further and talk not about sailors but about carpenters, they of course have to design a lot. And then on the other hand you could also try to think about, okay, but the sailboat has been designed and that designer could either or could not take into account the phenomenology of sailing when he's making the boat. And then your question would be, yeah, but what does it mean? Why? How does it guide me in designing the sailboat? Right?
Without being a sailor, I think it's impossible.
Yeah, maybe one thing would be that you have to be able to take this first-person perspective. So just some pictures of how sailboats are supposed to not bump into each other won't help you anyway. Suppose you were designing a tool on the sailboat that helps people determine whether boats in the distance are bumping into them or not. Right? That would be the most literal design case for this example of the sailing. Then, before you know it, people start to make these pictures of from the top view of boats, and then saying, "Oh, we need to detect all the boats on the lake." And then, before you know it, you get an interface with a screen that looks like this. So if you don't know anything about the phenomenology of sailing and about phenomenology in general, you will probably make right next to the steering wheel, you will make a screen like this, and on the screen you see the whole lake, and then you see here your own boat, and then you see here other boats. And then with this boat is like red, like, oh, it's almost it's bumping into you. That to me would be an example of an interface design that is purely Cartesian. It is really taking an objective view, and you are yourself are an object that I'm looking at from a distance, and all the other boats are also objects that I'm looking from the distance. So maybe a more phenomenological thing would be to just take the whole boat, and this boat, I'm looking here, and make a whole ring of small LED lights. And then when I see here a boat in the distance, oh, you can hardly see it, and this boat is approaching me, then maybe this LED light starts to blink, so that I direct my attention to looking there. And then the LED light actually would help me in learning the skill faster, so that I don't need it anymore. I think a lot of these tools that would take into account phenomenology would help you in becoming more autonomous in dealing with the world, instead of taking over from you and then asking you to understand the interface in order to be able to read off what they tell you. Right? That's the difference for me.
But isn't that what skilled people might do? They adapt to the sailboat as it's already built, and they don't see as something they could be redesigned, because they got familiar with it. Even in the beginning, this was really difficult for them. Maybe.
Yes, that's true. Now I think there's still a difference between something being difficult and never getting any real satisfaction about it, even if you learn to deal with it in a skilled way. And some computer interfaces are like that. So they don't give you any satisfaction in terms of that you are proud of yourself, that you've learned a skill. It's just another set of tricks that you have to put in your backpack and you have to take with you in your journey in the world every day, because otherwise you can't operate the damn machine. But learning to play a violin, for instance, is very different. It's also very complex. But once you've mastered it, the whole violin becomes part of who you are, really. And you are sort of proud of it to be able to play the violin. So you can say, I'm a violinist. And what you say is not, I know how to operate this violin. No, you say, I'm making music. And the violin is part of my way of expressing myself musically. Now, I don't know about computer interfaces. For me, a lot of them are like sort of necessary hurdles that you have to take. And you can become, in a way, skilled at doing it. So there are some people that are really fast in and then they know how to solve the problem. But that's only for the people that in the end become computer engineers, right? For those people, the computer becomes like a violin. In a way, they play it like a violin. But for all the rest of us, we don't want to be violinists, musical, and sailors, and also computer scientists, right? A lot of people don't want to be computer scientists. Now, can we design computers that you don't have to be a computer engineer for in order to operate them and be not frustrated all the time? I think that's still a difference.
Do they have much to say about laser cutting and 3D printing?
No, they haven't. Well,
not the dead ones, obviously.
Maybe we should ask Peter Paul Verbeek what his opinion about this is. I don't know if he's ever written about it. Heidegger would definitely be opposed to it, because 3D printing first makes your skill into an abstract description in software, and then the whole making part of it is just outsourced to the machine, so to speak. So there is no skill anymore, basically. Then if you look at the cycles, like printing, reflecting, printing, reflecting, printing, reflecting, printing, reflecting, and then over a longer time your design, so to speak, grows through a series of prototypes, then you could say, well, in a way, skill is coming back into it, and it's going into the right direction, because for a time, actually making something as complicated as this projector was something that we could only do completely rationally, thinking out every aspect of it on paper beforehand, and then finally, when it was made, that was the end of the project, so to speak. So in that sense, 3D printing now has a possibility of bringing in craftsmanship again. So you could go either way, I guess.
I think it's interesting that people are designing with 3D printers, so they have the skills like programming and some understanding of mechanics, and a lot of them they're trying to create their own 3D printer.
Yeah.
And it's totally different from, I mean, this was a part of a designer's work,
Yeah.
but now the 3D printing is more widespread. So you're learning through trying to create the 3D printing, I think, and you get, I mean, it's not working properly, so you have to go back and go forth, and I think it's, in that sense, it's a part of the phenomenology approach of designing it. I don't know, when you try to create your own tool into, I don't know, let's say it like that. But you have to have skills, multiple skills, programming, maybe material knowledge.
Those are not the skills, it's knowledge. It's not the same. Yeah, because you have the knowledge of the computer and this thing, but you can put all these things into your head, but that doesn't mean that you are.
No, exactly. That the phenomenologists would really agree with. So even if I read 3 books about 3D printing, but everybody knows this. As soon as you start and you take the second thing out of the box already, you think, it doesn't fit. Or I tried to put together a bike of my son that we bought at the Bilka, so it was all taken apart, and then I was trying to get on one of the pedals. The other went on right fine. And I was trying, and I was almost at the point of trying to take tools to change the wiring of and luckily I didn't do it. And then my son said maybe it should go the other way, and I was like, oh, it should go. And then after an hour I found out that the other pedal goes the other way, so I could actually. But these things, that's not theory, yeah? That's just you have to really do it, experience it, practice it.
But he must have known somewhere he must have seen that you can go 2 ways, because otherwise you wouldn't have said that.
Yes, sure. Yeah. So there is also something as knowledge, right? What phenomenologists would say first is that let us first bracket that away, which is what Husserl would say. Because it's not fundamental. It's not that knowledge came from somewhere. It came from other embodied coping from my history, or even from culture, from the whole human. So all these people before us that were embodied copers, and this stuff sort of sedimented in our routines and cultures, and the way we raise our children, and the words we use, and how we guide them and steer them. So you first need to bracket that away, and then they would say it figures in the way you deal with the world, but it's not the prescription or it's not the programming of the machine that sets you in motion or something like that. It plays a role in the whole.
But why do we learn this as this video analysis things that we do? Because then it would be better if we just follow a course in truck driving.
In truck driving, yeah.
Take the skill and then we can design the cars.
Well, you'd have to ask Jacob, but I think that what he's trying to do with the toy trucks and with the video is to at least get a little bit more close to the actual practice than you would have if you would just have been given a manual about truck driving and were allowed to have to interview the truck driver manager for an hour, which was the classical. That was what you would have as a designer, right? You would get some manuals and you would be allowed to interview some people, and they would sit in a separate room and talk about truck driving. Now you actually have hours and hours of video of people actually doing it. Of course you are an observer, but that is because you are scientists, and you, as a scientist, you are already the distant observer of this stuff, and you're trying to get back into it. But it's very hard. So yes, it would have been most ideal to sit right next to the person and observe and learn from that person.
But do you say something about this? How the ideal way to design these things, or to research the design?
Well, so people like Lucy Suchman would say that you need to do some kind of anthropology, some kind of ethnography to dig into it. And most of these phenomenologists, they don't really, that's a problem, eh? They don't really look at a particular given situation that they are not themselves part of. They always start with their own experience of the world. So I guess if none of these phenomenologists is a sailor, then they won't ever say anything about sailing. They only talk about the things that they are themselves already a part of, because they just talk very basically about how do I perceive the world, which means it's personal. But now, in that sense, that's a big challenge. It's an interesting question, because designers always have to design for someone else. And then there's already a situation. There's truck driving and truck driving practice and so on. I don't think they have much to say on that. But you can you can just say, acknowledge that for every one of those truck drivers, all of this applies. So, and then your problem is to somehow deal with it. But they don't solve the problem for you.
Maybe an approach to how to design. Because also in architecture, there are a lot of phenomenologists that they base their design in phenomenology. But in the end, you don't see that in the design. But for him, he's based his design on phenomenology and not constructivism or some other approaches.
It can sometimes be a little bit more. Well, of course, it's also this. Then it's just like art, right? You have the art that is sort of inspired by phenomenology. Where's my? So you have this Cézanne. Actually, he was not really trying to draw a picture that would correspond to your phenomenology so much as that he was trying to solve his own problem of how he was looking at the apples and the pears and the bread and the tablecloth, and how he could what he needed as sort of internal guidance in so how he should understand his own task in order to be able to get the right result that would fit for him. So, for instance, what he said was that he read a poem about some tablecloth being thrown on the table like a fresh bed of snow, and every time when he tried to paint a fresh bed of snow, he failed to paint it as a fresh bed of snow. And then in the end he found out, well, I will find the quote. It's here. So, a tablecloth white as a layer of fresh fallen snow upon which the place settings rose symmetrically crowned with blonde rolls. All through my youth I wanted to paint that tablecloth of fresh fallen snow. Now I know that I must only paint rows symmetrically, the place settings, and blonde rolls. So there's three things for him that became meaningful from the poem as guiding his actions as a painter. He had to paint that something was rising, that it rose symmetrically, and he had to paint the place settings, and he had to paint blonde rolls. If I paint crowned, the place settings rose symmetrically crowned with blonde rolls. If I try to paint crowned, I'm done for, you understand? But if I really balance and shape my place settings and rolls, as they are in nature, you can be sure the crowns, the snow, and the whole shebang will be there. So, how he applied phenomenology, which was much more in how he as an artist relates to his work and the example that he tries to paint and so on. But it's different from design.
Do you think there's such a thing as affordance overload? It's like when you have too many opportunities, or there's too much material that you have some skill required to do something really well.
I think there can be...
or is that just the same?
Yeah, there can be two answers to that based on what phenomenologists would say. One would be that an affordance always exists against the background, and the background is determined by where you are at that moment in your work. So it is as if you enter new rooms all the time, and in this new room there is one new affordance, but all of the rest is gone that was before. So it's not that the affordance really pops out. It's not that like you have like 1,000 affordances and then you have to choose from them, because that would make affordances into kinds of objects in the world that you have to select, or like this long list of possible actions that you have in your head, and then you have to determine which is the right action. The affordance is much more like it's the thing that connects the whole world and you into one focal point, which is the action that you should take at that moment. That's one answer, but there's another answer which draws on this example from a famous baseball player, and there's lots of sports people. This baseball player, at some point,
Babe Ruth?
No, it's not Babe Ruth. It's at some point he was a pitcher, and at the moment he wanted to pitch, for a second he thought, how should I do it? And from that moment on, then he threw completely wrong. And then from that moment on, each time he wanted to pitch, this thought came up: how should I do it? Or what am I doing? And then his whole skill was sort of killed. So you could maybe say, that there is this, you could become ever more skilled and skilled and skilled at something, and that you could sort of go over the edge, and then the whole framework breaks down, and then you're totally in despair. And there have been multiple examples of baseball players and also other sports people that have had that crisis, in which they suddenly couldn't do anything anymore.
That's normally linked to how they think other people see them at that moment.
Maybe.
A lot of artists on the stage
yeah.
playing this Frozen.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's thinking on how others perceive them, and they start criticizing themselves. I also see that with students when they get this blockage at exam, they normally have a discussion going on with themselves that's negative tone. So I think it's linking up to that.
Yes, I think that really also plays a big role, and all of this is also, as merleau-ponty would say, what I do, I always do already in some kind of social setting or context. But I think for this baseball player, it was much more having to do with that he started to think about how. Suddenly he started to think about how it's actually how did he actually manage to throw the ball straight, and then you're sort of lost, right?
Yeah, but you don't know what action it makes you think.
No, yeah, I don't know.
So it could be a situation.
Could be, yeah. Okay, we're finished. Yeah. Thanks very much.